In the Kremlin, an important guest has arrived. The supreme leader of a rising superpower, here to see an angry Tsar at war. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin showing the world that China and Russia are together. Their militaries work together. Their economies work together. Their diplomats work together. And despite Russia's war on Ukraine and all the turmoil that it's causing, China is doubling down on this relationship. Check out what Xi said to Putin as he left the Kremlin, speaking through his translator.
Как раз сейчас перемены, которые не было в течение 100 лет. Пойдем вместе, двигаем эти перемены.
A year after Putin went to war, this sounded like two men on a mission to reshape the world. But what is that mission, and what does it mean for the rest of us? In part 1 of this video, we'll explore how China and Russia have become so closely intertwined.
This is just a natural match made in heaven.
70% of China energy depends on import, and Russia can really help in a big way on those imports.
Chinese military has benefited tremendously from Russian military import.
In part 2, we examine the mission that's binding them even closer together.
Xi Jinping really views Vladimir Putin as a crucial partner in weakening the United States.
Russia is a very useful and important asset and partner in this long-term struggle. It's increasingly the emperor and the Tsar.
Both China and Russia felt a lot of similar sentiment that they have been forced by the US to stick together.
And in part 3, we'll look to the future. And wherever we look, we see the spectre of conflict. For the American-led Western powers,
China and Russia could combine their war plans and create an extremely effective force for targeting the United States.
The question is whether we have to plan, in the event that we had a war with China, that China and Russia would be working together.
For the rising power of India, friend of Russia but threatened by China, and growing acutely aware of the dangers.
The realities of conventional war, it's not something of the past. It can still happen. That is something we need to be preparing for now.
And we explore the implications for the Ukraine war. The stakes are high for everyone, and the end game is very far from clear.
Imagine that Russia does a large exercise or escalates in Ukraine at the time where China wants to make a move on Taiwan. I think that would put a lot of US defense planners into a tough spot.
The whole mankind is at a crossroad. War or peace, we may end up going back to the Stone Age and very, very dangerous.
One thing that's striking right now is just how many leaders say that we're approaching a decisive time in the world. Xi Jinping calls it a crossroads. Joe Biden talks about an inflection point. Here in Germany, Olaf Scholz calls it a watershed moment. But whichever term you use, it's a time fraught with danger. And central to what happens next is the relationship between China and Russia. War games in Russia's Far East. The Vostok exercises bring together a host of Russia's friends. Chief among the guests is China. This is just the latest in a run of drills between Russia and China and other partners that's intensifying year by year. From the Middle East together with Iran, to the far south of the Indian Ocean together with South Africa, and even going beyond the scope of exercises to bring Russian and Chinese operations closer together.
In recent years, we have also done some what we call the joint patrol, be it in air or you beat at sea. So this kind of joint patrol are not exercises. They're just kind of joint operations.
Operations that have made their neighbors wary around the Sea of Japan. On multiple occasions, US allies Japan and South Korea have scrambled jets in response and published detailed charts of naval and air force movements to show that they are on alert. The joint patrols are part of a wide-ranging roadmap for military cooperation signed by Russia and China's defense ministers. A further deepening of a relationship that goes back a long way.
Chinese military has benefited tremendously from Russian military import ever since the 1990s.
Zhou Bo is a retired senior colonel of the Chinese military, the PLA.
So today, Chinese military is growing with strength, but without Russia's assistance, for decades, and our own efforts, probably the Chinese military would not be as strong as it is today.
Relations between the two sides ruptured during the Cold War over ideology and territory. They even came to open conflict along their eastern border. US President Richard Nixon exploited these tensions to build ties with Beijing in the 1970s. But as the Soviet Union veered towards collapse, an opening came.
In the 80s, when pragmatic leadership arrived in Moscow and Beijing, they decided that sorting out this territorial dispute, not investing a lot of resources and money into this potential confrontation between two nuclear powers, but focusing elsewhere, is worth it. And that's where the foundation for the relationship was built.
Alexander Gabuyev is a Russian expert on China based in Berlin.
After collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia emerged as the major provider of military hardware to China. China was under sanctions following the Tiananmen massacre in '89, and Russia was the only source of sophisticated military technology, and China obviously used that to its advantage to buy a lot of stuff, and by the way, keep the Russian military industry afloat.
This was a time of political and economic turmoil in Russia. It desperately needed money. Soon China became a new market not just for weapons, but for its vast natural resources. When Vladimir Putin came to power, he quickly signed a wide-ranging treaty with his opposite number, Jiang Zemin, to cement the relationship further and pave the way to fully settling the border issue.
In 2006, the border was finally demarcated, and since that time, maintaining peace along this more than 4,000-kilometer border is paramount for both Beijing and Moscow.
By this time, China was in the World Trade Organization. Its ticket to becoming the economic giant we know today. A transformation that Russia would play a part in.
This is just a natural match made in heaven. Russia has abundance of natural resources, needs capital and technology. China is the exact opposite.
And for Putin, China became a source not just of economic strength, but of tools of repression for a regime that became more authoritarian the longer he stayed in power.
China is one of the secrets for longevity and survival of the system that Vladimir Putin used to build.
And in 2014, as Putin's ambitions spread outwards with the annexation of Crimea, he set Russia on a still clearer course towards China and away from the West. This is where you can see the relationship between Russia and China becoming something deeper than a matter of trade and oil and technology and even repression. It's become a joint mission, a mission that the world caught an early glimpse of here in Germany, what seems like almost a lifetime ago. Munich 2007. The world has gathered for the annual conference on global security. The most eagerly awaited speaker is Vladimir Putin. In his opening words, he makes clear this will be no ordinary speech.
Формат конференции дает мне возможность избежать излишнего политеса. И если мои рассуждения покажутся нашим коллегам излишне полемически заостренными, либо неточными, я прошу на меня не сердиться. Это ведь только конференция.
Then he let loose with a tirade against what he described as a unipolar world.
Что же такое однополярный мир? Как бы ни украшали этот термин, он в конечном итоге означает на практике только одно. Это один центр власти, один центр силы, один центр принятия решения. Это мир одного хозяина, одного суверена.
And that master, he said, was America.
Отдельные нормы, да по сути чуть ли не вся система права одного государства, прежде всего, конечно, Соединенных Штатов, перешагнула свои национальные границы и, по сути, во всех сферах, и в экономике, и в политике, и в гуманитарной сфере навязывается другим государствам. Ну, кому это понравится? Кому это понравится?
This was Putin railing against almost every facet of American power. But central to his complaint was the enlargement of NATO. The NATO alliance had gained 10 new members since the end of the Cold War, all of them from the former Eastern Bloc, which had been dominated by the Soviet Union. None of these countries had been forced to join NATO. Far from it. They clamored to join, to cement their futures as secure democracies under the ultimate protection of American nuclear forces. And at the NATO summit in 2008, more lined up behind them, with Georgia and Ukraine saying they wanted to join too. Ukraine's president stressed his country's right to choose.
Україна є незалежна, суверенна держава. Проголошені в Україні національні безпекові політики співпадають з основами безпекової і оборонної політики, яку проводить Північно-Атлантична організація.
Putin was invited to the NATO summit, and his objections loomed over the event. Germany and France were especially wary. The result, Ukraine and Georgia got just vague promises that they would one day join. But they were still promises, and Putin condemned the move.
В границах мощного военного блока, действия членов которого регулируются в том числе и статьей 5 Вашингтонского договора, будет воспринято в России как прямая угроза безопасности нашей страны.
4 months later, Russia was at war with Georgia. This was the first manifestation of a fundamental conflict between the right of self-determination of Russia's neighboring states and Putin's insistence that their choices posed a threat to Russia's security and its status. Ukraine would become his greatest fixation.
Putin is obsessed over control of Ukraine. He believes that without control over Ukraine, Russia is not a great power, it's not an empire. And I think that this proposition has never been tested in the Russian domestic discourse, like why dominating this 40 million nation is vital for Russia's prosperity and security in the 21st century. But that's what Mr. Putin believes.
These obsessions with Ukraine, with NATO, and with American power have driven Vladimir Putin all the way from that speech in Munich all those years ago to the violence and destruction that we see today. His relationship with the West is effectively over. Instead, he's nurtured one critical friendship with a man who increasingly sees the world in the same way. Xi Jinping came to power in China in 2012 after a run of extraordinary growth and development. But the political system was beset by corruption and a sense of drift. Xi's answer, a public crackdown on high-profile corruption cases, increasing political repression, and talking up a patriotic quest, what he called the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. The consequences of this have already been huge. China's technological transformation has made it not freer, but more of a digital police state. With its internet walled off and its citizens subjected to a degree of surveillance never seen before. Under Xi, China has been accused of mass human rights violations against the Uyghur minority in the western province of Xinjiang. It has smothered a pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong and stripped its people of freedoms that Beijing promised when it took over from British colonial rule. This has caused alarm for the people of Taiwan, who fear what could happen to them. Xi has placed taking control of Taiwan as central to his project of national rejuvenation, ramping up military threats and raising fears of a wider war over Taiwan with America. China has also caused alarm among its neighbors in Southeast Asia, laying claim to the vast majority of the South China Sea. It's built military infrastructure on disputed islands and shoals thousands of kilometers from its shores. And around the world, Xi's Belt and Road project is rolling out infrastructure on a massive scale, bringing with it economic and political influence Beijing has never had before. For Xi Jinping, this is all working towards a goal that is still a couple of decades away, but almost every aspect of it pits China against the West.
The optics is very much the centennial of creation of the People's Republic of China. That will be in 2049. And by the time the party strives to turn China into #1 global power and ending 500 centuries of global dominance of the collective West. So global power redistribution and emergence of China as #1 global superpower.
And from Xi's standpoint, one thing stands in the way of achieving that vision: the US. Under Donald Trump and Joe Biden, US policy towards China has taken a hawkish turn, responding to Xi's ambitions. A new consensus in Washington sees China as America's biggest global challenge, a rival on trade, a risk on technology, and an outright threat on security.
We're getting billions of dollars a year from tariffs from China.
The result, a trade war from Trump, bans on high-end tech cooperation from Biden, and a sweeping effort to coordinate with American friends in Asia and beyond. The Quad brings together the US, Japan, India, and Australia, advocating what they call a free and open Indo-Pacific. AUKUS binds the US and Australia even closer together in a submarine alliance with the UK. And in the G7, Washington has agreed with Europe, Japan, and Canada on the need to reduce risky dependencies on China. Xi Jinping has lashed out against all of this, saying this to Communist Party delegates in Beijing. Western countries led by the United States have implemented all-round containment, encirclement, and suppression of China, which has brought unprecedented severe challenges to our country's development. It's a perspective that seems to echo the Putin view of the world.
The US is putting a lot of pressures on China, on Taiwan, and many other issues. So you can see that also US formed so many alliances surrounding China.
Wang Huiyao runs a think tank in Beijing and has close ties to the Chinese government.
So all those things make China insecure as well. And I think Russian probably feel the same. And I think in that sense, they have some common feelings because they all feel this Western pressure led by the US. Both China and Russia felt a lot of similar sentiment that they have been forced by the US to stick together.
This is underpinned by a deep bond between the two autocrats.
shared animosity towards the US is very much the glue that brings the two men together. It's increasingly the emperor and the Tsar. And since it's far less an organized, institutionalized autocracy, but a just more personalized regime, definitely the relationship between the two men is of paramount importance. Xi Jinping and Putin are age mates. Putin is just 6 months elder. They are, in a way, soulmates. There are so many similar traits. They have hardships in their youth. Both fathers fought in World War II against the Germans and the Japanese. They both have daughters. So there is a lot in common that brings them together. And I've seen them in person, I think, once. And you see through the body language that the rapport is really there.
Xi Jinping spoke publicly about this during a visit to Moscow in 2019.
我同普京总统建立了密切的工作关系和深厚的个人友谊。6年来，我们会晤近30次。俄罗斯是我到访次数最多的国家。普京总统是我最好的朋友和同事。
This personal bond got its greatest expression in Beijing in February 2022. As China hosted the Winter Olympics, the two men announced another step up in their relations, a partnership without limits. What made this all the more striking was the fact that at the time Putin was on the verge of invading Ukraine. Ever since, people have been asking, how much did he tell his best friend?
Based on what I know, they danced around the topics, and China's primary concern was nothing happens before the end of the Olympics. And what they were anticipating was just a very limited scope military operation, maybe focused on eastern Ukraine, not an all-out assault on Ukraine.
Whatever the truth, Putin made his appearance at the Olympics and went home to start his war. The fallout has pushed him even closer into China's embrace.
Russia doesn't really have alternative economic partners amid Western sanctions. Russia is the most sanctioned nation on earth. So Russia is rapidly diversifying its economy towards Asia-Pacific, and that's where China is definitely the major partner that provides market for the Russian resources, technology that Russia relies on, including military technology and dual-use goods.
When you look at this relationship, driven by Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, you can see that the personal and the structural dimensions are deeply connected. The two men share an obsession about American power, but it compounds an underlying and potentially inevitable conflict between ambitious autocracies and established democracies.
I think that the structural factor is the most important, and if we can imagine different leaders presiding over pretty similar power structures with non-democratic US skeptical regimes, we might end up in the same result.
Feeding this is a fear in Beijing and Moscow that Washington sees their regimes as illegitimate, and a paranoia that America has regime change in both capitals as its ultimate goal.
The Russian view is that the US wants to bring down Russia first and then address China. That's something what the conspiratorial-minded Russian leadership believes. It might not be true, but that's unfortunately what's driving a lot of their calculations, also including war in Ukraine. They are concerned in very physical sense about expansion of US security alliances and where they seek to work together to undermine this US dominance in the global system.
So that's the joint mission, beating back a global system led by America that Putin and Xi perceive as a threat to their ambitions. It's a mission that manifests itself in many places. Like at the United Nations, where China is trying to redefine human rights and democracy, tapping into influence gained through the Belt and Road Project.
We see China dominating at the Human Rights Council and inserting some of Xi Jinping's phrases about community of shared future into documents.
Bonnie Glaser heads the Indo-Pacific program at the German Marshall Fund think tank in Washington, D.C.
convincing countries that human rights should be underpinned by economic definitions, not necessarily the kind of freedoms that we think about in the West.
In the UN Security Council, Russia and China routinely vote together, for instance on how to respond to North Korea's nuclear program. In fact, a high-profile trip to Russia was the latest sign that Kim Jong-un is getting increasingly active support from the two powers. That visit came just weeks after Russia's defense minister and a top Chinese Politburo member attended a military parade in Pyongyang, complete with nuclear missiles that could reach as far as America.
China and Russia have voted together now to not impose more sanctions on North Korea. They don't want to continue to implement these sanctions. So they see North Korea as a continuing partner of Russia and China.
Dictatorships in the unstable Sahel region spanning Africa are also getting Russian support, with Moscow squeezing out Western influence and quashing hopes of democratic development. This dovetails with China's Belt and Road investments across the continent. On a global level, China and Russia are pushing for an international cyber treaty.
This would protect themselves because they could further control the amount of information coming into their societies and try to gain advantages in the ways that cyber could even be used in wartime.
Also in the BRICS, the growing club built around Russia, China, Brazil, India and South Africa, Moscow and Beijing have been pushing to shift global trade and investment away from the US dollar. This is potentially attractive to emerging economies vulnerable to swings in US monetary policy, or countries that fear the reach of Western sanctions linked to the dollar. Increasingly, China is positioning its currency, the renminbi or RMB, as the answer. Russia is already playing along, accepting RMB for commodities sales to China. This sidesteps the US financial system that it's been shut out of since the war began. But Putin's war has also brought along some problems for China.
The war in Ukraine, it's a mixed bag for China. On one hand, it really keeps the US distracted. A lot of resources are being spent on European security. The flip side is that the global economy gets more destabilized. Then also China sees certain alienation of Europe from China. And then when people say we should focus more on potential nightmarish scenario in the Taiwan Strait because of what happened in Ukraine, and we need to start to de-risk, diversify away friendshore, offshore. So all of that discussion is amplified by Russia's war in Ukraine.
So despite the no limits rhetoric, there are some limits to this relationship. China is not overtly supporting Russia's war, and most importantly, it is not a full-scale military alliance, with a guarantee like NATO's Article 5.
China would not give Russia an Article 5 type of guarantee because it would ultimately need to be involved in war in Ukraine, which it doesn't want to.
If China provided military assistance to Russia, then we probably were going to have really the dawn of the Third World War, with China, Russia standing on one side and NATO led by US on the other side. This is the worst nightmare. So China's non-participants, in this kind of war is out of its own interest, of course, but it is also has demonstrated huge responsibilities for the world.
This highlights the two sides of Xi's position, trying to persuade the world that he's taking a responsible position, while signaling to Putin that when it comes down to it, they're on the same side.
I think that the way that Xi Jinping came to Moscow, showing his unequivocal support, basically, not saying that he approves of the war against Ukraine, but saying that the first state visit is to Russia. He comes extra to see his friend in the Kremlin and spend nearly 3 days with him. That's a big show of support.
And short of a military alliance, there's still huge potential for the two powers to work together.
Both countries are religious about strategic autonomy, but they can integrate their militaries and military-industrial complexes without giving these formal commitments, and that will make it far more dangerous.
So where is this heading? In part 3, we turn to 3 areas where China and Russia could join forces even more effectively and find out what that might mean for the world. Gansu Province, Western China. It's 2021, and high above the Earth, satellites from the US firm Planet Labs scan the desert, following a lead.
There had been some rumors that we were undercounting the number of nuclear launchers in China.
Decca Eveleth is a nuclear weapons researcher based in Monterey, California.
We had seen some construction of a limited number of silos at a concepts of operations site at a place called Jilantai. A silo is effectively a large reinforced hole in the ground that you can launch a missile out of. And so we decided we were going to go basically look to see if they had built up significant numbers of those patterns of silos. And we finally came across the ones near a place called Yumen, where they're building about 120 solid fuel missile silos.
There was a wind farm nearby, but the researchers were sure this was something completely different.
You had these inflatable covers. All of them were spaced 3 kilometers apart, and we saw trenches for communications wiring to cut and cover underground command bunkers.
China may show off its nuclear weapons at ceremonial parades, but it's always had far fewer than either the US or Russia, which currently both have around 5,000 to 6,000. Now, that's changing. Fast.
Well, China's arsenal has been for a very long time relatively small, but it is growing. And by 2030, I think the prediction is that they will have about 1,000 warheads, and by the middle of the 2030s, as many as 1,500. So China is clearly on a trajectory of doubling and then tripling its nuclear arsenal.
But it's not just a question of numbers. China is also rethinking its approach to nuclear weapons, particularly its intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs.
Most of China's existing ICBMs that are currently deployed are on mobile trucks. So they drive trucks around, they have tunnels, and the idea is that it makes it harder for the US to target them because they're always moving. The problem with that is that it's a really, really expensive and complicated force to operate.
Now this rapid expansion of missile silos enables a boost in both numbers and reaction speed.
It's just a much more responsive force. You have, it's already in the silo, if you are on alert, most of the time you have a near instantaneous launch position.
This is China preparing its nuclear forces for a possible war with the United States. And for the West, there's another dimension to this.
We should not underestimate the degree to which Russia and China will work together. For example, developing shared nuclear planning. I think that's an area that would be extremely detrimental to Western interests.
Their combined forces are going to outnumber U.S. current forces if the current trajectory holds. And so the fear, I would say, is that, the fear has been that China and Russia could combine their war plans and create an extremely effective force for targeting the United States.
This is a nightmare scenario for the US.
The question is whether we have to plan, in the event that we had a war with China, that China and Russia would be working together. And I think that in our nuclear planning in the past, that has not been the assumption. And of course, if you combine those two arsenals, then we would be facing a massive threat.
China and Russia could coordinate in many ways that could leave the US struggling to respond.
In a situation in which there is a crisis or limited war with China, making sure that there are still deterrence assets in place to make sure that Russia doesn't do something in Europe, or vice versa. If there's a limited war with Russia, making sure that China doesn't see the opportunity to take Taiwan. That's the problem that we have right now.
On top of this, new developments in cruise missile technology could threaten even greater instability.
When you have these new technologies like stealth cruise missiles, you're getting into territory in which it's possible that you could destroy almost the entirety of the opponent's missile forces very quickly. And when you're in that situation, the solution is effectively that you need to be the first mover, right? So that's what I worry about, a situation in which both, for example, Russia and the United States have stealth cruise missiles, or both Russia and China and the United States have stealth cruise missiles.
With such weapons in future arsenals, the big three militaries could be on a hair trigger.
The room for decision making is very, very short. The window for decision here is extremely small. And that's what I worry about. And that's destabilizing, right? Because you have a situation in which now any amount of hesitation on one side would result in possibly unacceptable losses.
These are grim, dangerous scenarios. In the Cold War in the last century, the US and Russia tried to manage the risks around nuclear weapons with a series of arms control agreements. But those have all but died in recent years. Now with China, there's a new player in the mix. Is there any chance of getting the three sides to sit down and talk?
The United States first called for trilateral arms control discussions in the Trump administration. Of course, the Chinese were not interested. And I think it is unlikely that the Chinese are going to agree to that today. But going forward, as China becomes more confident in its power, and particularly in its nuclear capabilities, I think we should hold open the possibility that we can have arms control talks with China. It may be bilaterally, it may be trilaterally, but this is not something that we should rule out.
In the meantime, with China's weapons program advancing and US-Russian relations deep in crisis, the danger of an all-out arms race is real.
I don't think that we're currently in that big of an arms race. I think it's possible we might enter one sometime soon. But again, that depends, I think, largely in part on A, how bad the Russia situation gets, and 2, how China views its forces and how they want to talk about it. Because if China doesn't want to talk about it, then that limits a lot of what we can do. I'm hopeful that China will talk about it, but we'll see.
We could be facing a very unstable period until any efforts like that can get underway. And it's not just the US that's worried. We turn now to another major power that faces dangers and dilemmas from Russia and China getting closer: India. In the eastern Himalayas, there is a struggle underway. This is the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh, home to some of the holiest sites of Tibetan Buddhism. The Dalai Lama escaped here from Tibet after the uprising against Chinese rule there in 1959. China quashed the rebellion and controls Tibet to this day, and Beijing claims it should control Arunachal Pradesh too, and even calls it Southern Tibet. Against this backdrop, India has ramped up its troop presence here, bracing for violence after recent clashes with Chinese forces. And it's building up infrastructure too, trying to make it easier to keep hold of these remote lands. India has been on high alert along its vast border with China ever since fighting in 2020 killed dozens of troops. The biggest flare-up in decades in what is the world's largest border dispute.
60 years of border architecture went up in flames overnight. Since then, there has been significant troop buildup by both sides, and this is a live problem.
Tensions have been brewing since early on in Narendra Modi's period in office.
When Prime Minister Modi's government first came into power, they really tried hard to reach out to China.
Garima Mohan is a fellow at the German Marshall Fund think tank in Berlin.
We often heard of the China model of development being touted in India, really a hope of forging good ties and relationships with China. However, that was spurned from the Chinese side when we almost simultaneously with these meetings started seeing more incursions on the India-China border.
Delhi has also been unnerved by Xi Jinping intensifying Chinese engagement with India's neighbours, pouring investment into Sri Lanka, into Bangladesh, and into India's arch enemy, Pakistan. And China's actions in its own backyard have worried Indian observers too.
All they see is now patterns of intimidation and aggression followed by China with most of its close neighbors, with Japan, of course, with the case of Taiwan in South China Sea, and now on the Himalayan border.
Taken together, all this has transformed Indian thinking on China from an open question to a serious sense of alarm.
What kind of international actor would China be as it rises? And the answer, unfortunately, is quite is a difficult one. It's a scary one. You have seen now the conversation in India change completely. Within the political spectrum, there is no single political party that sees China as a friend. China is seen as the most consequential foreign policy issue and existential threat to India.
What's doubly scary for India is China getting so close to Russia, something that throws one of Delhi's most important relationships into question.
The India-Russia relationship, I like to say, is one deeply rooted in nostalgia. Russia, previously the Soviet Union, played a very important role in the history of independent India as it was building its institutions, including the Indian military. So, for example, my parents' generation have a very romanticized view of the country.
It's also a relationship built on weapons. Russia has been India's biggest military supplier for decades. Now Delhi has to think about Chinese influence on its old friend.
It is definitely moving into the direction of Moscow being junior partner to Beijing. And that really is a difficult scenario for India, given that China is the most important threat India faces right now.
India already sees Russia and China coordinating more closely in groupings like the BRICS, as we saw earlier, and the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
I've even spoken to certain folks in New Delhi who mentioned that they were surprised by Russia's behavior. They've been surprised at how openly Russia has been batting for Chinese positions in these multilateral formats, where in the past, Russia would often hedge with India. They would use India, they brought India into SCO to balance China.
A bigger worry looking ahead, what happens if India's border conflict with China worsens and Russia leaves India in the lurch?
The realities of conventional war, I mean, it's not something of the past. It can still happen. It happened in Europe, it can happen in parts of the Indo-Pacific, and I think that is something, Taiwan contingencies, what happens next on the Himalayan border, that is something we need to be preparing for now, rather than waiting for it to happen or hoping that it wouldn't. That Russia could potentially play a spoiler role in the case of when the India-China conflict on the border heats up. Even if it doesn't play spoiler, it plays neutral, it can still have, tilt the scales in China's favor. And those are really dire consequences.
And one scenario is even more dire for India, where Pakistan enters the picture.
The possibility of a Pakistan-Russia-China axis for India is really the nightmare scenario. Given its geographical location, given its history with at least two of these actors, given its dependence on Russian weapons and arms and military technology.
So what does this mean for India's relationship with Russia?
As Russia-China alignment grows closer and stronger, there will certainly be tensions and fraying in India-Russia ties.
But if you think India might now make a dramatic break from its old friend, think again.
the real push in Delhi right now is to make sure somehow slow down this growing alignment between Russia and China, and to see where India can still play a role in keeping Moscow separate and keeping them engaged and slowing down this, what to the rest of us seems inevitable process.
Alongside this, Delhi is shoring up relationships with Western powers, particularly the United States, transforming what used to be frosty ties. Narendra Modi's recent state visit to the US brought an address to Congress and some major arms deals.
Prime Minister Modi's visit to Washington, D.C. resulted in some takeaways for India, which are often only given to US allies. India is not one, but it has still developed a very, very close partnership with the United States, with Japan, with Australia, in the Quad.
So what kind of world does Delhi want?
I think the Indian vision is still very much multipolarity. The idea would be to have several poles in the world, which is another reason why it continues to work with Russia and hopes that it isn't isolated, continues to deal with China in certain formats as well. But I think the ideal vision of multipolarity, when confronted with the realities of the world, has meant that India has had to change track. I think currently all of India's foreign policy choices, its vision from the world, is seen through the lens of the China problem. All the partnerships that India has, all relationships that India has, is refracted through the China lens. Who can help balance China, who can help compete with China, who can help provide alternatives to China.
That's how huge a factor China has become in the world today. And here in Europe, it's becoming increasingly clear that Beijing will play a significant role in any endgame to the war in Ukraine. So let's find out now what that could mean in the last part of this video. We're back in Munich. This time it's 16 years after Putin's famous speech. Now the conference is dominated by the war in Ukraine. China's top diplomat Wang Yi is here. He has an announcement to make, a position paper on ending the war.
中国在乌克兰问题上的方针归结为一句话，就是劝和促谈。我们将为此发表关于政治解决乌克兰危机的中国立场。我们将继续坚定地站在和平一边，站在对话一边。
This was China further honing its position on the war, presenting itself as an honest broker.
China wants to be more as a guarantor, as a helper, as a mediator, as some kind of a convener. I mean, anything that China is needed, China would be willing to do, and China wants to see the war ending. And China's president is talking to President Zelensky, has talked to President Putin.
And yet there are strong doubts that Xi could be an honest broker. China's rhetoric has consistently underlined its sympathy for Russia's narrative.
Putin actually is not the first Russian president who warned against NATO expansion. Actually, this came from a Soviet leader like Mikhail Gorbachev down to Boris Yeltsin and then to Putin. So Putin's difference from his predecessor is that he not only gave warning, but he also carried it into action.
And NATO will be a key question in any talks to end the war. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has been pushing hard for membership. It would be the ultimate security guarantee, a victory for Ukrainian self-determination, and for the West. It's the very thing Putin railed against in Munich all those years ago. And it's something China clearly doesn't want today.
Well, China certainly doesn't favor any NATO expansion. If Ukraine stayed out of NATO, probably things could be easier to reach a peaceful process.
China simply does not want to see a serious defeat for Russia. So it's helping Putin as much as it can, while being cautious about Western red lines.
China does at least three things. It keeps the Russian economy going by purchasing Russian hydrocarbons and other commodities by providing Russia access to RMB. China keeps Russian industry going, including military industry. The red line for the Chinese, communicated by the Americans, is not violation of sanctions in a very overt way, and no supply of kinetic military goods that would dramatically help the Russian military effort. I think that for the time being, China keeps these two red lines and respects them. But I think that everything outside of the scope of the red lines is really helpful for Russia to continue this lengthy and tragic war of attrition.
So Putin gets this support from China and backs up his position with a threat to resort to nuclear weapons if he doesn't get his way. A threat designed to deter greater Western support for Ukraine, and a threat that Chinese voices highlight.
I believe the best outcome is Ukraine will lose some new territories in addition to Crimea. So where are these new territories? It is somewhere within the 4 provinces that are already declared by Russia to be Russian territories. Then the worst outcome is President Putin decided to use a tactical nuclear weapon.
And the whole mankind is at the crossroad. War or peace, we may end up going back to the Stone Age and very, very dangerous.
Xi Jinping has publicly distanced himself from Putin's nuclear threats, part of his effort to appeal to Europeans and open up transatlantic divisions between them and the US. So you can see the outlines here of Moscow and Beijing taking a multi-pronged approach to Ukraine. Russia digging in for a long war, taking any help that it can get from China. Beijing keeping Moscow afloat, while doing what it can to divide the West. And Putin backing all of this up with threats of nuclear escalation.
He feels pretty confident that time is on his side, that things don't go well in the front lines, but they don't go utterly miserably for him. And then at some point, the Western will to support Ukraine might be broken. We might have Donald Trump back, we might have a different president in France, we might have a different chancellor in Germany, and that's where Ukrainians start to fight internally, and that's ultimately, he doesn't get control over Ukraine, but he keeps what's left of Ukraine broken, dysfunctional, miserable, depopulated, and that's a good enough outcome. That's his bet.
And for China, that might look pretty attractive, a situation it could potentially take advantage of.
Right now, there is a war, in Europe, which will last for many years. Nobody knows how many years, but this is the only conclusion we know, that it will simply last. So for many years, NATO will simply be bogged down in Europe.
Imagine that Russia does a large exercise or escalates in Ukraine at the time where China wants to make a move on Taiwan. I think that would put a lot of US defense planners into a tough spot, because you obviously need to allocate resources to address the challenge in the West, in Europe.
This underlines that any endgame in the war is going to be about much more than Russia and Ukraine. It's going to be a test of wills and resilience for everyone involved. Russia and China together, and Ukraine and the entire collective West. Autocracies versus democracies at loggerheads over the future of the world. The drama in Russia over the mercenary leader Yevgeny Prigozhin challenging the military leadership raised questions over the Kremlin regime, questions that matter for China.
The concern about potential instability in Russia is going to be there going forward, and Beijing will be watching this closely.
But there is little expectation that China will abandon Russia.
Xi Jinping really views Vladimir Putin as a crucial partner in weakening the United States. It is my view that it is no longer possible to drive a wedge between Russia and China, if it was ever possible.
The view in Beijing is that China is in the spirit of prolonged confrontation with the United States. And nothing short of full surrender will deliver fundamental improvement in US-China ties. So China thinks about its relationship with Russia in a way in counterfactuals. So what if we throw Vladimir Putin under the bus, criticize his unlawful invasion of Ukraine, introduce sanctions of our own, demand that he vacates all of the Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, then probably Putin's regime is doomed at some point and it collapses. And then there is a new government that wants to be friends with the West. So the West will just pocket this concession and say, thank you, China, goodbye. Now, what about Xinjiang? What about Taiwan? What about your IP theft? What about your technological programs that really challenge the US dominance in those fields? What about your military buildup? So China will lose a very valuable partner and instead get even more problems with the United States.
It's a cold calculation, but a powerful one, drawing two men, two regimes, ever closer together. They need each other, the Emperor and the Tsar. So that's where we stand. Russia and China determined in their mission to take on the West. The United States rallying the West together. Powers like India seeking to find their own way. It sounds a lot like a new Cold War for our century. The world on a knife edge.